Hi, everybody. Rhonda Craig here again. Lesson number 34. Going to give you some of my answers. I did have an opportunity to talk to one of my students, my sweet, precious grandson-in-law, and he knew all the answers except one, and I'm not going to tell what he didn't know. I'm going to try to go through and just tell you what my answers to what I think it is. I ask, first of all, do you know what a covenant is? And I think everybody would probably say it's a contract. Well, that's not good enough. We don't really understand an irrevocable contract. In the Western world, we just don't understand that, and so I'm grappling with something that we can relate to, and I'm thinking we have a trust, and a trust. Let me just read the definition. The definition of a trust is an agreement that is unbreakable, irrevocable. It's a legal relationship in which the holder of a right, or whatever it is, gives it to another person or entity who must keep it to use it solely for another's benefit. Now, that trust that we have, we know that it will be carried out because it's a legal binding document. And if it's broken, whoever breaks it will be liable to lose. Okay? That's kind of the way a covenant is. And for just lack of something to compare it to in our modern day, and I tried to think, well, why did God allow the cutting of the blood covenant? And I'm just using my brain here. I don't. This is not scriptural, but when you think about a covenant, I ask myself, is parenting a covenant? Absolutely, it's a covenant. And that covenant, we enter into a covenant with our children without them even knowing it. But we promise to take care of that child and do whatever needs to be done. That's the covenant. If you're living up to that covenant that you have with Almighty God about parenting, it's because we have the foundation of our relationship with our parent, God. That whole parenting thing, the family here on earth, is a reflection of exactly how God intended his relationship to be with his children. In the New Testament, Christ talks about the church, or his called out people, as his bride. That's because people back then understood the marriage covenant. The bride was in covenant with the husband. They were in covenant with each other. Anyway, I digress. But as long as civilizations have been, there has to be a way to secure an agreement. And I don't think God invented this. I think man probably did. But the cutting of the blood covenant. And back in number 6, if you don't understand that covenant and you need to go back and look at number 6. That's when I talked about it. And then number 7 tells you about the covenant between David and Jonathan. So go back and look at that. It's quick and easy, and I think of knowing about the covenant is a game changer for me. It was anyway. But there weren't any lawyers. There weren't any courthouses to file a legal document. I can remember my granddad used to do business at the bank in Lexington, Oklahoma, on a handshake. It was as good as a binding document, and his word was his bond. Well, that isn't the way it is anymore, but there weren't any lawyers or courts or any way. So to make a legal binding document, they cut the blood covenant. I don't want to go into that right here because I intend to review that when I start in talking about the new covenant. Okay, the second question was, let's see here. Is parenting a covenant? Yes, I believe it is. Is marriage? Yes, I believe it is. It is a covenant. Why bother with the Old Testament? That was the one of my questions. Because that is the foundation upon which, if you don't understand covenant, the New Testament ain't going to make a bit of sense. And it sure isn't going to make a bit of sense when you say, well, Jesus died for my sins. Well, what does that mean? What does that really mean? A lot of people won't ask that, or won't say, well, what does that mean? But I am. They just take it for granted. Yes, and that's okay. He did. But how? That's the new covenant. Okay. And you can't do that one until you learn the Old Testament. And now, another question that I asked was, well, let's see here. Teaches because in the Old Testament, that old covenant, learning about the old covenant, we learned about God's faithfulness. We learned about his forgiveness. We learned about his willingness to give second chances. But we also learned there are consequences. Just like when your children don't do what they're supposed to do, what you have taught them to not do, and they do it anyway, most of the time there's consequences. Let's suppose you have said to them, now, you don't drive over the speed limit because you could have an accident. The speed limit is there for your protection. Well, if they go 110 miles an hour and have an accident and become injured, it's not because you were mean. It's not because anybody was mean. It's because there were consequences to not following what should have been followed, the speed limit. The speed limit was there for their benefit. Same way with the covenant. And that's the way any agreement is. If there are consequences for not following and rules are not, the rules were not there to just because their power struck. No, the rules were there. When God put people here on this earth and set them here and gave them everything they needed, everything, and then they didn't follow it. They decided to go out on their own, do their own thing. Well, there's consequences to that. And from the beginning, God had a plan. God had a plan to bring them back. And the longer they went without God in their lives, the worse they got. As they repopulated the earth, the worse they got. But there were some who didn't. And those who didn't, he made a covenant with. One of my questions was, who was the first one that had real detail about making a covenant? It was Abraham. Go back and read that in Genesis, and it'll tell almost all of the blood covenant rituals are there. And Abraham, God knew he couldn't do it. He couldn't walk through that blood in his presence, in that, so he put him to sleep. And while Abraham was asleep, he had the vision of a torch walking through that blood, and that was God Almighty. I digress. I will go on with my little answers to these questions. The covenant ritual steps, I will say this. First of all, they have to agree. First thing they take off is their jacket, because that's who they are. That says, this is who I am, I'm giving it to you. The belt, that held their weapons, that's giving it to them. You're exchanging weapons, saying, whatever you fight for, I fight for. Whatever you've got, I've got. They split the animal and they walked in the blood because that's where the life was in that blood. Then they put a mark in their body. Usually it was in their wrist or their palm. In the case of the Israelites, they were circumcised. And they didn't wait till they were grown to decide if they wanted to be in covenant. No. Their offspring, 8 days old, were circumcised. Their male children. They exchanged names. You see that in the marriage covenant. My name used to be Mantooth. It's Craig now. I'm in covenant with Dick Craig. Then they would have a meal that sealed the covenant meal, and usually it was bread and fruit of the vine, which represented the blood, or wine. It says. And then sometimes they would make a memorial, a tree or a stack of rocks if there weren't any trees around. Anyway, that's the ritual steps that I asked if you knew about them. If you don't know them, go back and look at number 6. The lineage. It was a way to prove. Why did we have this lineage? It's a way that God had to prove. This is what I think. It proved over all those thousands of years that God kept his promise. They began to prophesy about a Messiah. There's 55 prophecies about a coming Messiah that's fulfilled in the New Testament. And that's God's way, that lineage. I mean, they bring it all the way down. In the last one that I gave you two ago, in number 32, I read in Matthew the lineage all the way back to Abraham for Jesus. I think that's the most incredible thing. But that's God's way of proving. Now see, I told you I would, and I am, and here it is. And that's why they preserved it in the books of the Old Testament. 12 sons of Jacob. I didn't expect you to remember this one. You got he had 4 wives. Jacob's name was changed to Israel. He had 4 wives. Actually, 2 wives, Leah and Rachel, and then their surrogate mothers, their handmaidens, were surrogate mothers for those 2 ladies, those 2 women. And Leah had Reuben, Simeon, Levi, and Judah. And poor old Rachel, she couldn't have any. So, or she didn't have any. So she said, okay, surrogate mother, you can have 2. So she had, Bilhah had Dan and Asher, I believe. Leah says, well, my surrogate mother can do the same thing. So then I believe her name was Zilpha or something. I forgot what her name was. It doesn't matter. But she had Gad and Asher. And then Leah started having kids again, so she had Issachar and Zebulun. And then lo and behold, Rachel had Joseph. And then she got pregnant and had Benjamin and died in childbirth having Benjamin. So now you've had a quick rundown. His name was Israel. Those are the 12 sons of Israel, and they became the 12 tribes of the Israelites. Let me see here. Priestly tribe. Who was that? Levi. And what tribe was Moses from? Levi. What tribe was David from? David the king, David? Judah. I asked you, did you think about why Judah? Because I always thought, well, it should have been Joseph. Well, I'm going to let you go back and look at some of the other ones, and you decide why God chose Judah instead of maybe Joseph. Joseph's sons did not stay with the tribe of Judah when they split. Nope, they went with the northern tribes, and they lost their identity. This reminds me. If you haven't gone back and just start on number 4. That's the trek through the Bible. Just start there. Go back and look at all of them. You might learn something. Then I ask you, why did God wait to give that law to Moses hundreds of years later? Why did he just write it on tablets of stone for Abraham? We don't really know. But I got an idea. My idea is this, and I couldn't. Okay, if there's any pastors watching or any scholars of the Bible, tune out right now. This is Rhonda's opinion. I think it was God's intention from the beginning that His ways would be written on their hearts, like it is in the New Covenant. That's what He wanted. He didn't want to have to put down all the do's and don'ts. Because if you put down the don'ts, you got to have consequences. And they just kept getting worse and worse, even to the point of sacrificing their own children. Ugh. Which is exactly what the United States has done with abortion. I won't go there right now. But finally, when Moses brought him out of Egypt, out of slavery, and they had been 400 years without having any teaching, just whatever they could glean from their parents. They didn't have the... And I'm amazed in 400 years that they kept them and they knew who they were. I don't think all of them came out of Egypt. I think some of them decided to stay. But those who did still were skeptical. And so I just think God said, I'm just going to write it down. It should be common knowledge. You don't kill somebody. Okay, thou shalt not murder. It should be on your hearts that you should not commit adultery with another man's wife. Or even if you don't have a covenant with a woman, you shouldn't be having sex. So He wrote all these 10 commandments. Now, in the New Covenant, we're going to do away with those? I think not. But here they are. And then He gave Moses all these different laws. And if you read back in Leviticus on all the laws and everything, a lot of them were for health. If you had mold in your tent, here's what you're supposed to do to get rid of them. A lot of them were just sanitary laws. But a lot of them weren't. A lot of them just was intended to help them know what's good for them. Not because God is mean or power-struck. This is what you need to do to be happy. This is what you need to do to stay safe. Because He was a God of love. Just my opinion. All I got to say for now. I'll be back and we're going to talk about the New Covenant and the Messiah next time, hopefully. Hope you've enjoyed. Bye-bye.